The moment Evelyn Ashkam heard the words, she tightened both arms around the enormous bundle of white and silver fur pressed against her chest. Snowbell stirred beneath her cloak, pale blue eyes blinking up at her as if she could feel the danger in the cold afternoon air. Across the front steps of Ashkam Manor, Lady Beatrice stood perfectly still. Evelyn could stay. She could keep her room. She could continue living beneath the roof that had belonged to her father, but only if the cat was gone before sunset. For a moment, Evelyn could hardly believe what she was hearing. Snowbell was not some stray animal she had picked up from the road. Her mother had placed the tiny kitten into Evelyn's arms shortly before illness took her away forever. Since then, Snowbell had been there through every funeral, every lonely night, and every year in which Ashkam Manor had slowly stopped feeling like home. Beatrice did not care. To her, Snowbell was nothing more than a useless creature, taking up space in a house she now considered entirely her own. But Evelyn quietly reminded her that Ashkam Manor had once belonged to her father. That was when Beatrice's expression changed. If Evelyn wanted to defend the cat so desperately, then she could leave with it. Before sunset, no money, no carriage, no promise that the doors would ever open for her again. Fear twisted inside Evelyn. She had nowhere certain to sleep that night, and barely enough coins to last a week. Still, she did not put Snowbell down. Instead, Evelyn packed one small case, wrapped her beloved cat tightly inside her cloak, and walked through the iron gates without looking back. What neither woman noticed was the lone rider beyond the hedgerow. Duke Alexander Ravenshire had stopped there only moments earlier while inspecting nearby estate land. He had heard almost everything, and it was not Evelyn's beauty that held his attention as she disappeared down the road. It was the fact that she had just chosen to lose her home rather than abandon something helpless that trusted her. Alexander had never met Evelyn Ashkam. But before riding on, one question had already taken hold of him. Why had a gentleman's daughter just been driven from her own home? The road toward the village stretched farther than Evelyn remembered. With every step, Ashkam Manor disappeared behind the trees, and the reality of what she had done settled more heavily upon her. She had left with one small case, a handful of coins, and no idea where she would be sleeping by nightfall. Yet she never once regretted carrying Snowbell with her. Long before Beatrice had entered their lives, Evelyn's mother, Lady Margaret Ashkam, had been the warmth of the house. During the final months of her illness, she had surprised her daughter with a tiny white and silver kitten, telling her that something so small could still fill a lonely room with life. Not long afterward, Lady Margaret was gone. Years passed before Evelyn's father remarried. Beatrice arrived gracious and attentive, so determined to please that Evelyn had once believed they might truly become a family. Everything changed after Lord Ashkam died 2 years ago. The servants who had known Evelyn since childhood gradually disappeared. Household accounts became Beatrice's private concern. Whenever Evelyn questioned anything, she received the same answer. Her father had left his widow almost complete control. Evelyn had believed it. Until now, she had never imagined she possessed any real choice. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the countryside. Alexander was still some distance behind when the first drops began to fall. He had not approached because he wanted to see where Evelyn intended to go before deciding whether his interference would be welcome. Then the rain came harder. Evelyn quickened her pace, but the worn leather strap on her traveling case suddenly snapped. The case struck the road. A dress, a book, and several small belongings spilled directly into the mud. Evelyn bent down in alarm, and Snowbell wriggled free. The frightened cat darted across the road and vanished beneath the horse, approaching from behind. Alexander pulled the reins instantly and dismounted. By the time Evelyn reached them, Snowbell had flattened herself beneath the horse, her enormous tail twice its usual size. Alexander crouched carefully and eventually coaxed her out. The moment he brought her close, Snowbell stared into his face and hissed. Alexander looked almost offended. Apparently, he observed, the cat had already formed an opinion of him. For the first time since leaving the manor, a smile touched Evelyn's face. She usually has excellent judgment. Alexander laughed. He helped gather her muddied belongings, then offered to take her as far as the village. A Ravenshire estate carriage could be summoned from a nearby gatehouse. Evelyn resisted at first. Accepting help from a stranger felt dangerously close to accepting pity. But Snowbell had begun trembling beneath the wet cloak, and pride could not keep the animal warm. So Evelyn agreed. Not long afterward, the carriage rolled toward the village, with Alexander seated opposite her. For several moments, he said nothing. Then, almost casually, he asked whether her father had truly left her nothing. Evelyn's eyes lifted sharply, because she had never told this stranger anything about her father. Evelyn did not answer Alexander's question immediately. Instead, she watched him with new caution, wondering how a stranger could know so much about a life she had never discussed with him. Alexander offered no real explanation. He simply told her that certain things were easier to notice than people imagined, then allowed the subject to drop. By the time the carriage reached the village, the rain had softened to a steady mist. Alexander brought Evelyn to a small, well-kept cottage near the edge of the village. Its owner, Mrs. Whitmore, had once worked at Ashkam Manor and had known Lady Margaret well. The elderly woman's shock at seeing Evelyn soaked and carrying a mud-stained case quickly turned to concern, and she offered her a room without hesitation. Evelyn accepted only after making one thing clear: she would find employment as soon as possible. She would not spend her life depending upon someone else's kindness simply because Beatrice had forced her from home. Alexander said little, but the determination in her voice stayed with him. As they spoke, Evelyn noticed something else. Whenever the conversation touched upon estates, inheritances, or the families who owned land throughout the county, Alexander seemed to know far more than an ordinary gentleman should. He understood legal arrangements, remembered names she had barely mentioned, and spoke of local properties with the familiarity of someone accustomed to managing them. Her suspicion was beginning to grow when Alexander stepped outside the cottage. Several villagers passing along the lane immediately slowed. One man removed his hat, another bowed. Then Evelyn heard the words that changed everything. "Your Grace!" She stared through the doorway. The stranger who had rescued Snowbell from beneath a horse, the man she had teased only an hour earlier, was Duke Alexander Ravenshire. When he returned, Evelyn's entire manner had changed. Alexander noticed immediately. He seemed almost disappointed that the easy conversation between them had disappeared, simply because she now knew his title. But Evelyn had another question. Why had the Duke of Ravenshire been close enough to Ashkam Manor to know anything about her father? This time, Alexander did not avoid the truth. He admitted that he had witnessed her confrontation with Beatrice. Embarrassment washed over Evelyn. The last thing she wanted was a powerful man's pity. But pity, Alexander made clear, was not what had brought him this far. What troubled him was something else entirely. He could not understand how Beatrice had possessed enough authority to drive Lord Ashkam's daughter from the very estate her father had once controlled. Evelyn explained what she had believed for 2 years, that her father's will had left Beatrice almost everything. Alexander went very still. He had known Lord Ashkam, and that did not sound like the man he remembered. Before leaving, Alexander reached down to stroke Snowbell. The enormous cat deliberately turned her face away. Evelyn almost laughed, but Alexander's amusement disappeared long before he reached Ravenshire House. That evening, he summoned his solicitor and gave him a single instruction: find the original will of Lord Ashkam. Alexander did not return to Mrs. Whitmore's cottage the next morning. He waited 2 days, long enough, he told himself, for his visit to seem connected to the questions surrounding Lord Ashkam's estate, rather than to Evelyn herself. He brought only a small piece of information. His solicitor had confirmed that several estate records were missing from the local registry, which meant the original will would take longer to trace. Evelyn thanked him, but she refused when he offered to cover her expenses while the matter was investigated. She wanted work, not protection. That answer gave Alexander another reason to think of her. A week later, a legitimate opportunity appeared. Ravenshire House had fallen behind on correspondence connected to its charitable funds, requests from village schools, struggling tenant families, and widows seeking assistance. Evelyn was educated, organized, and needed employment. Alexander offered her the temporary position. This time, she accepted. At Ravenshire House, he began noticing things he had missed during their brief encounters. Evelyn remembered servants' names. She stopped to speak with frightened children instead of walking past them. When an elderly tenant became embarrassed while explaining his financial difficulties, she listened without making him feel small. And Evelyn began noticing Alexander too. The Duke everyone treated with such formality carried responsibilities that seemed to follow him into every room. Decisions about land, employees, tenants, and families were constantly placed before him. Sometimes, when no one else was watching, he looked tired. Snowbell, however, remained unimpressed. For several visits, she refused to go near him. Then, Alexander discovered that small pieces of cooked chicken could apparently succeed where ducal authority had failed. Within days, Snowbell began appearing whenever he entered a room. One afternoon, Evelyn returned from delivering several letters and stopped in the doorway. Alexander sat rigidly beside the fireplace, with Snowbell sprawled across his lap, her enormous silver-white fur covering half his coat. He looked at Evelyn with exaggerated displeasure. "This animal has no respect whatsoever for rank," Evelyn smiled. "Perhaps that is why you like her." For a moment, neither of them looked away. Something had changed. Alexander was beginning to anticipate Evelyn's arrival each morning. And Evelyn was beginning to understand why that frightened her. A duke could afford rumors. A woman in her position could not. Unfortunately, the rumors had already begun. Before the week ended, word reached Ashkam Manor that Evelyn was spending her days at Ravenshire House. Beatrice's reaction was immediate. If Alexander's interest continued, sooner or later, he would begin asking the wrong questions. That evening, she locked her bedroom door, crossed to a small writing desk, and opened a drawer she rarely touched. Inside lay a folded document. At the bottom was Lord Ashkam's signature. Beatrice understood that removing Evelyn from Ashkam Manor had not been enough. As long as the Duke continued seeking her company, Evelyn was becoming more dangerous with every passing day. So Beatrice chose a weapon far more useful than open cruelty: reputation. Within a week, Carefully placed stories began circulating through drawing rooms and dinner tables. Evelyn had supposedly arranged her encounter with Alexander. She had attached herself to Ravenshire House because she knew marriage to a duke could rescue her from financial ruin. Then came the darker rumor. According to Beatrice, Evelyn had accumulated debts so serious that Ashkam property had once been used to secure them. The document Beatrice had taken from her locked drawer soon reached Alexander. It appeared convincing at first glance. Evelyn's name was connected to a substantial loan, and Lord Ashkam's signature appeared beneath an authorization attached to it. Alexander said nothing, not yet. Meanwhile, Evelyn knew none of this until she attended a modest gathering hosted by one of the county's older families. The room changed when she entered. Conversations softened, glances lingered. Then, while passing an adjoining sitting room, Evelyn heard two women discussing how quickly a penniless woman could become ambitious when a duke was within reach. She did not wait to hear more. She left before anyone could see how deeply the words had struck her. By the following afternoon, Alexander understood that something was wrong. Evelyn returned the correspondence she had been working on and told him she could no longer continue at Ravenshire House. He tried to persuade her that gossip meant nothing to him, but that was precisely the problem. Alexander could survive whispers without losing his place in society. Evelyn could not. Every kindness between them could be twisted into proof that she wanted his fortune, and somewhere beneath her humiliation was an even more painful fear that no one would ever believe a woman with so little could love a man with so much without wanting what belonged to him. So she left. Snowbell rested against her chest as Evelyn crossed the entrance hall, but just before the doors closed, the enormous cat twisted around and stared back at Alexander. He allowed Evelyn to go, for the moment. Then he returned to Beatrice's document. The signature was remarkably convincing. The date was not. Alexander remembered that week clearly. Lord Ashkam had been hundreds of miles away on royal business when the authorization was supposedly signed. That single mistake changed everything. Before nightfall, Alexander summoned his solicitor and ordered a complete search of every financial document Lady Beatrice had filed after her husband's death. The deeper Alexander's solicitor searched, the less Beatrice's story survived. Within days, documents began to surface from separate offices that had never been meant to be compared side by side. Lord Ashkam had not left Evelyn penniless. Far from it. His will established a substantial inheritance for his daughter, and upon her 24th birthday, part ownership of Ashkam Manor, along with several income-producing properties, was supposed to pass directly into her control. Evelyn had turned 24 months earlier. Beatrice had simply made certain she never knew. Rental payments meant for Evelyn had been redirected. False debts had been entered against the estate. Papers were altered until the accounts appeared so burdened that Evelyn would have had little reason to question why there was supposedly nothing left for her. The loan carrying her name was another fabrication, and once Alexander understood that, other pieces fell into place. After Lord Ashkam's death, Beatrice had not merely taken control of money, she had slowly stripped the manor of nearly everything that reminded Evelyn of the family she had once known. Lady Margaret's portraits disappeared from prominent rooms. Long-serving household staff were dismissed. Personal belongings were packed away. Snowbell had simply been the last thing Beatrice could not remove without forcing Evelyn herself to go. Alexander took copies of the evidence to Mrs. Whitmore's cottage. Evelyn read them in silence. For years, she had believed she remained at Ashkam Manor because Beatrice allowed it. Now, she discovered that Beatrice had been living partly from property that should already have belonged to her. Alexander did not offer to buy her another house or replace what had been stolen with his own money. He placed the documents before her and told her plainly that what had been taken could be restored through the law. This belongs to you. Whether you ever wish to see me again is entirely your decision. That was when Evelyn finally understood the difference. He had not investigated because he wanted her indebted to him. He wanted her free. But Beatrice was already preparing one final accusation. Before Evelyn could formally challenge the estate accounts, word spread that valuable jewelry had disappeared from Ashkam Manor on the same day she left. Officials arrived at Mrs. Whitmore's cottage to search her belongings. Evelyn watched in disbelief as a jeweled brooch was removed from the bottom of her traveling case. She had never seen it there before. Beatrice arrived soon afterward, wearing the wounded expression of a woman pretending she had hoped desperately to be proven wrong. Then Alexander entered. He looked at the brooch. Then at Beatrice. Interesting. The room fell silent, because 3 months earlier, Beatrice had sold that very brooch through a jeweler in another county. Alexander's solicitor had already obtained the record of sale, and for the first time since Evelyn had walked out of Ashkam Manor, Beatrice looked afraid. Beatrice's final accusation did not merely fail. It opened the door to everything she had spent 2 years trying to hide. Within days, a formal hearing was called to settle the ownership and accounts of Ashkam Manor. Local magistrates, estate representatives, and several families who had heard Beatrice's version of events were present. Beatrice arrived dressed in mourning black, carrying herself with the same confidence she had always shown in public. She seemed certain Alexander would finally distance himself from Evelyn now that scandal surrounded the Ashkam name. Instead, the Duke arrived, carrying evidence. One document followed another. Lord Ashkam's original will established Evelyn's inheritance clearly. Property records proved that several profitable holdings should already have passed into her control. Account books showed rental income disappearing after her father's death. Then came the false debts, including the authorization supposedly signed while Lord Ashkam had been away on royal business. Finally, Alexander's solicitor produced the jeweler's record, showing that Beatrice herself had sold the brooch 3 months before it was mysteriously discovered inside Evelyn's traveling case. There was nowhere left for the truth to hide. Then, an elderly former Ashkam clerk entered the room. He had kept silent because Beatrice had threatened his livelihood, but faced with the records before him, he admitted that she had ordered alterations to the estate accounts and instructed him to make several payments appear to be debts. Beatrice's carefully constructed story collapsed around her. Evelyn listened without triumph. When she finally addressed her stepmother, her voice remained calm. The money could be restored, the property could be returned, but those were not the things that had wounded her most. For 2 years, Beatrice had taught her to believe she was powerless. She had convinced Evelyn that she possessed nothing, belonged nowhere, and had no right to question the woman controlling her life. That was the cruelty Evelyn would remember. By the end of the hearing, Evelyn's inheritance and authority over her portion of Ashkam Manor were formally recognized. Beatrice was stripped of control over the property she had mismanaged and left to answer for the forged documents and diverted funds. Hours later, when the house had finally grown quiet, Evelyn found Alexander alone near the gardens. There was no hearing now, no scandal, no inheritance standing between them. Alexander admitted that on the day outside Ashkam Manor, he could have revealed himself immediately, but what stayed with him was what Evelyn had done before she knew anyone important was watching. There had been no audience to impress, no duke whose favor she could gain, only a frightened woman facing the loss of her home, and an animal that trusted her completely. I think that was the moment I began wanting to know you. Evelyn looked at him. Because I refused to abandon a cat? Alexander smiled. Because you refused to abandon someone who trusted you. Somewhere between Snowbell's determined dislike of him, Evelyn's stubborn independence, and the afternoons they had spent working beside one another, his curiosity had become something far deeper. He loved her. But Alexander asked for nothing in return. Evelyn had her property now, her income, her choices. If she ever chose him, he wanted it to be because she wanted the man, not because she needed the Duke. For several quiet seconds, Evelyn said nothing. Then Snowbell appeared from the garden path. The enormous fluffy cat walked straight past Evelyn, crossed the space between them, and settled calmly beside Alexander's boots. Evelyn stared. Alexander looked down at Snowbell. And for once, the cat had chosen first. The months that followed were quieter than anything Evelyn had known in years. For the first time, she was not living under someone else's control. Ashkam Manor was placed on sound legal footing again, its accounts restored, its tenants properly paid, and the rooms that had once felt cold gradually became hers once more. And Alexander did not rush her. He courted her openly, patiently, and without pretending that what had happened between them began as some grand romance. Sometimes they walked through the gardens at Ravenshire House, speaking about books, estate matters, or nothing important at all. Sometimes Evelyn would enter Alexander's study and find him trying to rescue official papers from beneath Snowbell's enormous body. The cat had developed a habit of stretching across whatever document seemed most urgent. Alexander would lift her carefully, move her aside, and within moments, Snowbell would return. Evelyn never failed to laugh. At other times, Snowbell slept beside the fireplace, while Evelyn and Alexander talked long after the lamps had been lit. And although Alexander repeatedly claimed otherwise, the small packets of dried chicken that somehow appeared whenever he visited Ashkam Manor fooled no one. Least of all, Snowbell. Then, one clear afternoon, Alexander asked Evelyn to ride with him. He took her beyond the village and stopped beside a familiar stretch of road. Evelyn recognized it immediately. It was the road she had walked with one broken case, very little money, and Snowbell hidden beneath her cloak. The road where she had believed her entire life was falling apart. Alexander told her that he had watched her disappear down that road, believing she had lost her home, but perhaps, losing what had never truly protected her, had made room for something better. Then he took her hand. He did not ask her to become Duchess of Ravenshire, not first. He asked whether she would build a life with him, a life she entered because she chose it. Evelyn's answer came through tears and a smile. Yes, their wedding took place months later, beneath the high arches of the Ravenshire chapel. It was grand enough for a duke, but the moment that mattered most was simple. Evelyn walked toward Alexander with her head held high. She was no longer the frightened woman standing outside Ashkam Manor, waiting to be told whether she was allowed to stay. She came to him as a woman who had reclaimed her property, her confidence, and the right to decide her own future. By the end of that day, Evelyn Ashkam had become the Duchess of Ravenshire. Snowbell adapted to ducal life considerably faster. One afternoon, Alexander entered his private sitting room and stopped. Snowbell was stretched across his favorite chair, white and silver fur spilling over the cushions as though the entire house had been built specifically for her comfort. Alexander stared at the cat. Snowbell stared back. Evelyn began laughing before he even spoke. "I married you!" Somehow, she inherited the estate. And perhaps that was the perfect ending. The animal Beatrice once demanded Evelyn abandon, now slept beside palace fireplaces, wandered through Ravenshire House as though she owned it, and was adored by the very Duke she had once hissed at in the rain. Only much later did Evelyn fully understand what she had chosen that day outside Ashkam Manor. She had thought she was choosing Snowbell instead of a home. She had actually chosen not to sacrifice love simply because fear promised her security. And that choice led her somewhere Beatrice had never been able to give her and could never again take away. A home where neither Evelyn nor Snowbell had to earn the right to belong. And if you enjoyed Evelyn and Alexander's story, subscribe for more unforgettable tales of dukes, forbidden romance, palace secrets, betrayal, and the kind of love that appears when no one is expecting it.